Hello. Do you know how useState and useEffect works in React? Of course you know, but what I mean is, do you know how they are working internally? Can you think of implementation behind them? Don't worry. In this video, I'm going to create useState and useEffect from scratch and explain everything clearly. Welcome to Code with Ujjwal. I am Ujjwal Gupta. Let's create a project first. So I'm just going to create a React huge state folder. Let's open this folder in Visual Studio Code. Okay, so the project is open inside Visual Studio Code. Let's create a file called main.js, and inside the file we will write our code. Okay, let's talk about useState first. So useState is a method which is used to initialize the state. It accepts default value and return an array. The array have two value. The first value is state value, and the second value is a method which is used to set the state, right? So let's implement this. Okay, so I'm going to create a method useState, right, which will take default value, and will return an array. The array will have default value and a method which will be used to set the value, right? So just let's create a method, let's say set state, okay, which will accept a value and it will set the default value to the values passed, right? Okay, uh, set state. Now let's return the set state. uh, okay, now let's create a component, and inside that component we will use state. Okay, so let's call use state with a value 0. Let's name our value counter and the method to set counter. Okay, let's call set counter and set a different value. So default value is 0 and we are setting a value with 1. Okay, now let's execute my component and let's see what's happening. Okay, so we will just call node main.js. It runs, but nothing happens because we have not logged any value. So let's do one thing. After setting the counter to 1, let's log the counter value. Okay, okay, so the counter value is 0, but we have set 1. The good thing is that our method works and it returns similar results as useState in React, right? Now let's fix why set counter 1 is not working. Okay, now in React, what happens whenever you change the value, the React re-renders the component, right? But here when we are setting the value, nothing is happening. So what we need to do is we need to call the my component again when the value is set. So for simplicity, let's create a global method called render, and inside the render, let's call my component. Okay, and call the render here as we were calling my component. Okay, now what we need to do, we need to call the render whenever the value is set. So we call the render method inside the set state value. Now let's run this again and see what's happening. Okay, maximum call stack size exceeded, right? Now let's think about why this is happening. Okay, we first initialize the state with a 0 value, which works. Now just after that we called set counter 1 to set the value of the counter to 1. Okay, now as soon as we call the set counter, what it's doing, calling the render method again, which is re-executing the my component, right? So which means it will keep re-executing. So the state will be initialized to 0, then set counter will be called, set counter will be called with value 1, and which means render will be called again and again, right? which is creating the infinite loop. Now let's think about why this is happening. Now in order to solve this, we need to move state counter 1 to some events or something which can be called asynchronously, as you would call in React. So in React also, the value of state is set in an event, for example on click or something, right? So let's do one thing. Let's create a global method. Okay, global method. So we are inside Node.js, that's why we are using global. If you are in browser environment, then you need to use window, right? So let's create a global method called let's say set counter, and inside the set counter, we will just call set counter. Okay, it will take the value, and okay, now let's remove this. Okay, now let's call the state counter method from outside. So as soon as render method is executed, we will call the state counter method. Okay, uh, global dot state counter method, and pass the value to 1. Okay, now let's run our program and check if the issue of infinite loop is solved or not. Okay, so we can see the issue of infinite loop is solved, but the value of counter is still 0, right? Now why this is happening? Let's take a look at our code again. We initialize the use state with 0 and print the value of counter, which works. But when we are calling the state counter with different value, it's re-rendering the method my component, right? Which means the value is reinitialized again, and that's why the value of counter is 0 always, right? Now how to solve this? In order to solve this, we need to preserve our new state value, right? So let's save the new state value into a variable. So let's name our state new state. Okay, and inside the state we will store the value being passed into new state, right? So new state is equal to value. Okay, now instead of default value, we need to check if the new state exists and return new state. So what we will do, we will create const state value is equal to if new state exists. If new state exists, then return the new state, or otherwise default value, and return the state value here. Okay, now setting default value is equal to value doesn't make sense here, so let's remove the here. Okay, so now state value will be returned, which will be new state value or default value, right? Now let's run our code again and let's see what's happening. Okay, now it's fixed. So counter 0, now we have counter 1. Okay, it works well. Now let's create another state with text value. So what we are going to do, similar to counter and set counter, we'll just create text and set text. Okay, use state, let's say code with Ujjwal. Okay, similarly log console.log text, and let's create a global method, global set text, and inside the global set text we will call the set text. Okay, now we have initialized another state. Now let's call this set text from outside, similar to how we are calling set counter. So global dot set text with value, let's say code with Ujjwal is awesome. Okay, let's run the program. Okay, so counter 0 text code with Ujjwal. Okay, counter 1, but the text value is now 1, but we change the value to code with Ujjwal is awesome, right? why this is happening, why the value of text is 1 and it was a text value, not number value, right? So what happened? And at the bottom, if you'll see, the counter value is changed to text value, right? So there is something very messy. Let's observe our code and let's try to fix it. Okay. So why this is happening? This is happening because our code is written in a way that it handles one state, because we are storing the value of new state in a single variable, which means if we are using multiple state, then all those state will be stored in a single new state. So that's why we see the counter value is 1, but the text value is also 1, because the value of counter which was set is now being used in the text. Now when we call the set text with the code with Ujjwal is awesome, right? The counter value is changed, right? Now in order to fix this, we need to store the new state value in an array. Okay, so what we will do, we'll just rename this to new state array and initialize with empty array. Okay, also we need to keep an index which will be used to track the state by index. So if you are using two state, then the first state index will be 0 and the second state index will be 1, right? So let's rename our variable to state index is equal to 0. Okay, uh, now inside the state, the first thing we need to do is we need to store the value of new state in the array. So we will use new state array, state index is equal to value, right? Here also let's do one thing, store const current index is equal to state index, right? So current index new state array, we will get the value of the new state from the new state array and use the current index. Okay, here also let's use the current index. Okay, and at the end of the use state, we need to increment the value of state index, so that if next use state is called, then the value of state index will be incremented, right? So for our example, use state 0, the value of the state index will be 0, and for use state code with Ujjwal, the value of state index will be 1, right? Now let's run our code again and let's see the output. Okay, counter 0 text code with Ujjwal, counter 0 text code with Ujjwal. So before going down, we can see that there's an issue. The value of counter should be 1 here, but it's 0. Now why is that? So let's go to method useState and try to fix this issue. Okay, so inside the state method, if you will see, if we will call the state method, the render method is executed, which will execute the my component method, right? Which will call the useState method. Now when the useState method will be called, the value of state index was incremented already. So it was in our case useState, here it was 0, for useState code with Ujjwal it was 1. But when we call the state counter, the my component was executed again, which means the value of state index is now 2, right? The value of new state of 2 will be always undefined, right? So the problem lies with the state index. Whenever render method is called, we need to reset the value of state index. So let's go to render method, and before calling the my component, let's just reset it to 0. Okay, let's run our code again and see. So counter 0 text code with Ujjwal, counter 0, we have not saved, that's why. So let's run the code again. Counter 0 code with Ujjwal works, counter 1 text code with Ujjwal, counter 1 text code with Ujjwal is awesome. So now the values changed by set state is working perfectly, and we can use as many state as we want. So this is the implementation of useState. Okay, now we are done with useState. Let's talk about useEffect. So useEffect is a method which takes two parameters. The first parameter is a method and the second parameter is a list of dependency. Now what it does, it executes the method which was provided in the first parameter whenever the dependency value is changed. So let's implement this. Let's create a method of function useEffect, which will accept callback and list of dependency, and dependency is optional, right? What it does, it executes the callback, and callback can also return a clear method. Okay, so let's just store the result into a clear method variable. Okay, this is our definition of useEffect. Let's just use it inside our main component. Okay, useEffect. Uh, let's just log that useEffect was called. Okay, useEffect was called. Now let's run our code. We can see that useEffect was called. So definition wise, useEffect is okay. Now if we observe, useEffect was called multiple times, but the useEffect method should be executed only when the value of dependency is changed or for when the component is rendered. But here we have not passed any dependency. So let's fix our useEffect method first to be executed only once. So let's go to our useEffect method. What we need to do is we need to check if something had changed or not. In order to do this, let's create a state let had changed is equal to true, which means if the state value had changed or not. For the first time, yes, it had changed. That's why we are keeping the value to true. Once the use effect is executed, we will just mark had changed is equal to false. Okay. And if had changed is equal to false, then it will not be executed. Okay. Now let's run our code again. Counter zero text code with use effect was called is executed here, and after that there is no execution. Now use effect is executed one time only, right? Now let's implement change of dependency. So let's pass the counter state value, and we are already changing the state counter value to 1, which means it should be executed one time and one more time, right? So in order to track the dependency change, we need to store the older value of the dependency, right? In order to do that, let's create an array with variable name, let's say older state values for use effect. Okay, initialize it to empty array, and whenever the callback executed, we will just store the value of dependency into the uh, older state variable. Okay, so this represents our old state value. Now whenever use effect will be executed again with a different state, with a different state value, then we will compare if the value has been changed or not. Okay, so what we need to do, dependency dot sum val not equal to uh, we also need to take the index not equal to will compare the value with the older state uh, on the same index. Okay, and here we will assign had changed. Okay, if the value is not equal from the older state, which means state had changed, so this will be marked as true, right? Let's run the code. We will see use effect was called one time, use effect was called second time also, right? So now this is tracking the state change. Okay, now let's implement calling use effect once more. So now we will call the use effect with another state text. Okay, just text. uh, Here we will change the log message to use effect was called for counter, and use effect was called for text. Okay, let's run the code and let's see what's happening. Now if you will observe this, use effect was called for counter. This is being logged 3 times. So this was logged when the component was executed for the first time. This was logged when we change the value of state counter to 1. Okay, but why this is logged? We did not change the value of the counter, right? This is a bug. Now in order to find this issue, let's go to our method useEffect and try to debug. Okay, so what's happening when useEffect is being called for counter, we are storing the newer state value in older state value for useEffect, right? This is for the counter. But for the text also, we are storing the value of text also in this. So one state variable is being used to store the value of multiple state, right? So this is where the issue is. Now in order to fix this issue, we need to store the value of different state in such a way that we can access the each state without clashing with another one. Okay, so the simplest approach here is to keep the array, but inside an array, let's just store the value as object. Okay, so what we will do, we will create an index variable. Okay, so let's use effect index is equal to 0. Okay, and store the value in array as object. Simple. Okay, and at the end we will just increment the value of use effect index. Okay, now we need to further change the way we are accessing the values. Previously older state value was array, now it's an array of object, and we need to get the current index value. So first thing we need to do is store the current index is equal to use effect index. Okay, and get the current get the older value. Okay, older values. uh, so older state value for use, current index, and depths, right? So this is our older values of the state. We just need to replace it with the older state value for use effect here. uh, and I think this should work now. Okay, let's run the code and see the output. Cannot main.js 19. Okay, so we have a bug. So this is because for the first time when we are trying to access the depth value, the value of older state value for use effect current index will be null because we have not stored any data, right? So what we will do, we will just use the nullist operator, and here we will check if there is value, older value exists, and if the older value exists, only then use the hash change value. Okay, now it should work. So we see use effect was called for counter, and after that there is nothing logged. Okay, so again we have a bug, and this is a bug because the value of had change is global, right? So if the older value is not set, the had change value will not be sent, and the value of had change will be always false, right? So what we need to do, we need to move this had change value to inside the method. Okay, now let's run the code again. Okay, so use effect was called for counter. Oh, good. Use effect was called for text. Good. Use effect was called for counter. Good. Use effect was called for text. Good. Use effect was called for counter. Use effect was called for text. So we are getting the issue once again, right? The issue is not fixed. Why is this happening again? Okay, let's try to observe the use effect method once again. Okay, so we store the current index use effect. We store the current index in a variable and increment the value of use effect index, right? So this keeps incrementing, and we have not reset the value of use effect index, and that's why we're getting this error. So what we need to do, similar to use state, for the use effect also we need to reset the value of use effect index inside the render method. Okay, so what we will do, we'll just reset use effect index is equal to 0. Okay, uh, hopefully it should be solved now, but let's see. Right, so use effect was called for counter, useEffect was called for text. So these are the logs when the component is rendered for the first time. useEffect was called for the counter when we change the value of set counter. useEffect is called for text when we change the value of text. So now it's working perfectly, right? Now we are left with one more thing. So the callback of useEffect can return a cleanup method, which is called as soon as the value of dependency is changed, right? So let's implement this also. Okay, we have already stored the result in a variable called clear method. Now whenever the state changes, then we need to execute this clear method, right? Which means we need to store this value somewhere. So we are already storing the dependency value here, right, inside the array. So what we'll do, we'll just store the value here also inside the object. Since it's an object, so we can store this without changing much code, right? Now whenever there is dependency change and clear method is found, we need to execute it, right? Which means before executing the callback, we will check if older clear method exists from the array. So older state value current index, right? Current index is equal to current index dot clear method. Okay, so if older clear method exists, then we execute it, otherwise just leave it, right? Now let's write some cleanup method inside the useEffect. So let's just return the method console.log clear code. Okay, so before useEffect was called for counter, we should see the clear code, right? When the value of the counter is changed. Okay, so we have a bug, main.js. This is issue with the null check. So in case of first time initialization, the value of older state value will be empty, and that's why the value here will be null, and the clear method, of course, accessing the clear method will have issue. So we will use the nullis operator again. Now it should run perfectly. Let's see, right? So useEffect was, this is for the first time log. Okay, useEffect was called for the counter just before this clear call is executed, which means our code is running perfectly. So this is the implementation of useEffect and useState. That's it. That's the end of this video. If you have any question, please do ask in the comments. And if you like this video, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Thank you. Thank you for watching this video. See you in the next video. Take care. Bye bye.